Well, welcome, Jeff. I'd like to introduce Jeff Haller to our podcast of Feldenkrais Moving into the Unknown. And Jeff, being a Feldenkrais practitioner from way back, was involved in the Amherst training and has gone on to become a director of the Feldenkrais Training Academy and offers advanced trainings. Jeff has a background in martial arts, a black belt in Aikido and a PhD in transpersonal psychology. So since 1993 has been very focused on training people to become Feldenkrais practitioners. And Jeff, let me know if I've left anything else out, but I'm very keen to hear from you as to, from the Amherst training, what was memorable about that and where you think the trainings have evolved since then in the Feldenkrais method.
Well, the main thing that was memorable about Amherst, just one second. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
The main thing that was memorable about Amherst was Moshe. I mean, the genius of the man, the charisma of the man, the on-the-spot capacity to innovate and to improvise, the spontaneity of the man, the degree of the immensity of his intelligence, the immensity of his genius in his adaptability to the moment, and how widespread his thinking was. His thinking was, I don't believe that there wasn't a topic. I think he was truly a Renaissance person. And the thing that's important, I think, to understand is that Moshe represents an archetype. He's archetypal in the same sense that you might think of Freud as being an archetype, or you might think of O-Sensei, the founder of Aikido, or Jigoro Kano as an archetype. Someone who brought together an immense amount of material, and what they created, their name is on the material. They represent in some ways the material, but what they represent is an entire field of information. And Feldenkrais represents a field of information. We have to appreciate the elements that came into him. He had this traditional, deep Orthodox Jewish background, his Hasidic background, and his yeshiva schooling and his training, his academic training, which was formidable. He was a formidable scholar by the time he was 11, 12, or 13 years old in studying the Talmud. And so he had a Talmudic background. We have these academics that took him into being a PhD in electrical engineering and physics. We have his ability to find deep, profound philosophers and to bring their philosophy with him. His studies with Jacobi, his studies of Gurdjieff, his studies of Krishnamurti. And you go into his house and there were sections in his house, in his library. His house was basically a library with a bed in it. And every book was read. You go open the pages and in the margin were his notes. And there were thousands of books. And so he had an immense encyclopedic capacity in all of these fields. And so he had this huge section on Krishnamurti. So he had the world of the philosophers and Heidegger and the different people. And then, of course, he had his martial arts, he had his judo, and all of his jujitsu and judo training. And you bring all of that together into this one, and he became a fountain for, out of that, his own creation, that he created a unique, absolutely completely unique work that was significantly different than he'd studied Alexander technique, but his work was significantly different.
Jeff, I've got a question. In those days, then, how was his first book, Body and Mature Behavior? Then,
yes.
how well was that understood back then? Because it was written such a long time ago, 1940. I think this was his first book. But in that first training then, how did you perceive that? How well was that material understood, given that he seemed to have integrated a lot of those strands you've spoken about and infused them together? What did people understand back then?
We didn't have the book. It was, I mean, I'm sure it was available. His book, Awareness Through Movement, came out in 1972. And I think that was probably the book that most people had access to that were reading him. I mean, when you were in the room with Moshe, you knew that you were with one of the most unique people that the world has seen. So that was, you know, the book Body Mature Behavior, for me, took many years for me to really grasp the essential message of the book. And if you can finally look at this book as a letter to Sigmund Freud, then you can begin to understand what he's talking about, because he's basically talks about the very nature of how we're conditioned, how gravity conditions us, how our family, society, how our culture conditions us, how we begin to acquire a self-image, how by the very nature of who we're raised with, that our self-image is maladapted. And because we're maladapted, we experience insecurity and anxiety. And Freud would agree with that. But Freud had the idea that you know, from a conditioned place, what we do is we bring our habitual behavior forward in a compulsive and unconscious way. And so Freud's idea was that if we were going to help people with their anxiety and their insecurity, he was going to use psychoanalysis to help cure people. Moshe had the idea that our neurosis, in quotes, is hidden in our muscular habit. Yeah. And so he was very clever, especially if you read the chapter on tonic adjustment. And he's very, very clever in his description of what it takes to bring a person to the point where they are not bound by their historic phasic voluntary muscular habit, the place in which their phasic musculature, their voluntary musculature, takes over part of the work to stabilize them, to create compensations, or the way that they've created self-protection relative to being emotionally wounded, or to cover anxiety. And so Moshe is very clear. He says, if you're going to help someone, you have to bring them to the clearest, most simple tonic adjustment possible. That means to have a minimal tone to maintain your skeleton so that you have the freedom to move without hesitation. And if you bring a person to that place, then they cannot be in that historic adjustment, that historical muscular habit. That quality of being in yourself and composed in yourself that way we know it in terms of excitation and inhibition, it has inhibited that historical tone. And if you're in a new tone, you can't be in the old tone. And from there, you can begin to have a different composure. Yeah.
So then I think this also relates to the difference with Rolfing and Feldenkrais, because it's hearing what you're saying with Freud's interpretation of the human body, or the human, that's also had a Rolf, in that the memories are contained in the body, and the fascia has to be, in their world, is quite forcibly moved to alter the stature of the human. Whereas Moshe's Feldenkrais is quite different to that.
Well, I'll tell you a couple of stories, but basically, and I take this from the conversations I've had with my friend Roger Russell, the difference between Rolfing and Feldenkrais is that the Rolfing people forget the human. They think in terms of the body, and if you listen to Tom Meyer's talk, he'll tell you that it takes a long time to change fascia. But it doesn't take long to change a human. A human being has a prefrontal cortex, and we're organized to change our habits in a single moment, in a single go. Moshe is very clear in Amherst. Someone asked him, how long does it take to change a habit? And he says, oh, now these are heavy-duty criteria. But he says, with awareness, with clarity, without effort, and without being emotionally involved, without passion, if you see the habit that you're living in, if you see it clearly and specifically, you can stop that habit in a single go.
Wow.
Yeah. And our brain is organized to be able to stop habits in a single go. But you can see the criteria is a rigorous criteria.
So the rigor really is in the emotional attachment, from my point of view. Would you agree, Jeff?
Yes, the rigor is in the identification with the historic self-image, which is an identification of the limbic system. It is an identification of the limbic system. The limbic system's entire order of business is to provide safety for the person. Its job is to scan the environment and see to it that we're safe. And we become calibrated into what's safe. So when we've had physical injury and we no longer have the physical integrity that we'd like, we have to compensate. When we've been emotionally wounded, we have to self-protect. And what people call trauma, and as you probably know as well as I do, that trauma is an everyday term these days. It has become such a generality that every experience is a trauma in so many places. Now, a trauma is, in one sense, an experience where you don't have the resources to meet it. Now, if you had the resources to meet it, and you had the maturity and the internal composure to meet the trauma, or to meet a difficult situation, you wouldn't leave traumatized. You're traumatized because you need to protect yourself from something that you don't have the means to handle. Now, when you acquire the means to handle it, then there's no reason for you to continue to maintain the historic calibration that you've had. Yeah, you were calibrated from those moments. So we see people bringing their historical protections forward all the time. And they don't even know that they're doing it. They're wearing it like the suit of clothes. They're wearing it in the way that the tone within themselves, the tension, the way that they've come to maintain themselves. It's in their breath. It's in the way they create the neurochemicals in the brain and spread the neurochemicals throughout the entirety of their whole self. It is the way that they've identified themselves. And of course, people must have that identification until there's something better. Until there's some way of being composed in themselves where they can actually begin to look at the obstacles, the obstructions within themselves, or what Moshe would call parasitic behavior, parasitic muscular habit that's no longer necessary for the moment. And
Jeff,
when a person does come to that place where they're no longer in the parasitic habit or in the habit that they've used to compensate or to protect themselves, they are open for a moment. Yeah? So where's the difficulty? The difficulty is in the way that they're identified, the way that their limbic system serves to keep them safe. And Moshe's clever. He takes people into the prefrontal cortex, the orbital aspect of the prefrontal cortex, and it has first of all, its major capacity is to make distinctions, to distinguish differences. And it is the part of in our evolution, it is the part of our brain that seeks novelty, that is spontaneous, that works through imagery and is curious. It seeks novelty. Yeah. And so there you have these two elements of yourself, and they're working hand in hand. Part of your system is working like crazy to make sure you're safe. But the other part of you, our own curious nature, when it comes into action, then it modulates the limbic system. The limbic system becomes quiet. If the limbic system is really loud, then the prefrontal cortex is modulated and can't become active. Because when people are continually creating anxiety-producing thoughts and then going into the feelings that are underneath that and energizing the anxiety-producing thoughts or the fear-producing thoughts, because the thoughts of fear are not the same thing as fear, but they can touch into fear and then energize themselves into more thoughts. And when you're in that endless loop, which many people find themselves in and don't even know it, they have no way out of it until they become curious.
So we were chatting just before as to how in our training, the presentation of the training has happened for us. And of course, so taking what you said into consideration, it first comes with the movement. So a great deal of attention is paid to the movement. I'm wondering at what stage in the training, we're obviously involved in the thinking, feeling, sensing, doing, but
Yeah.
the emotional aspect, bringing that in early so that once we graduate as practitioners, we are equipped and capable to recognize what's coming in front of us in terms of the people coming with their questions.
Yeah, I think, yeah.
Does that come into play? Because in the beginning, we were thinking that, you know, it's all about the movement and it takes a while to get a handle on awareness through movement lessons. I'm wondering what you have to say about that.
Well, first and foremost, you know, it's not just being able to handle the issues that the people bring before us. It's to come into a profound sense of depth and internal, I keep using the word composure, so I'll stay with it, but this internal composure that can sit in uncertainty and difficulty. So you can sit with a person and create the space that's safe for them. So the first and foremost is the process. And it's always been assumed that the process of awareness through movement brings us into that place of safety. And I don't know that that's the case.
It's not.
I don't know that that's, well, in my own training in Seattle, you know, in the first segment, the question arose from the floor, can the Feldenkrais method heal my trauma? Yeah. Now, if you're really truly an advocate for and understand the Feldenkrais method, then you can say unquestionably yes. You can learn to find the quality within yourself in which the internal oppression, the clouds that pass over through your screen, so to speak. You can begin to have the sense that you are something more complete and whole than that, and these clouds of the past can begin to dissipate. Yeah. The clouds obscure you from being in touch with your own nature, your own essential nature. It's a well-known, there are well-known sort of metaphors in some traditions. For example, everybody knows, each of you know, obviously, that if you go outside and you look up through the clouds, you know that there's blue sky for an infinite blue sky above you. Yeah. The only thing that obscures you from the blue sky are the clouds. Now, what's your attention going to be on? Is it going to be on the clouds, or is it going to be on the infinite blue sky? And so there's always the question then of what is your own essential nature? Your own essential nature is always the openness of the blue sky. Mm-hmm. And of course, as the daily life goes by and with your calibrations and the things that have happened to you as you've gone through your life, of course, this essential sense of yourself is going to be obscured until you find the point where you can maintain your connection to the blue sky. And even if it comes through, it's still, the clouds when they come through, they just don't have the same impact on you. And you very, very gradually keep finding your relationship to the past being cleared. It's like a draining of yourself, and your past takes a different role for you. It becomes a resource, and it becomes a source for wisdom.
Yes.
Now, this can happen quickly if you're really well prepared, or it can take a very long time. But the lessons, we've always kind of heard that the Feldenkrais lessons are taught in a non-linear, open-ended way, and that people will come into their own place with them. But I personally don't believe that that's enough. I think that the issues have to be brought to the surface. They have to be brought to the surface, and then a continued process of the maturation process has to continue to take place. You see in the way that I teach the ATM lessons, I'm inviting people to find within themselves a sense of wholeness, and that each time they come to the class, and if they stay in the class, I believe personally that the connection that they make over and over and over again will become more intact. The things that happen in the environment, they'll shed more easily. What obscures them from being connected to themselves will gradually dissipate. Yeah.
And I think that's why I said no when you first raised that point, because there's sometimes an expectation that will happen instantaneously and it will stay. Like these new awarenesses will just be a permanent part of me now. But there's work involved, and there's a continual process to unveil those experiences and start to own them, so that they do become the new me, or the highest potential version of me.
Let's be careful with the term of trying to own them.
Okay.
Owning them is one step away from being them.
Yes. So being them is actually more, that's a much better way to say it. It's the being them, yes.
Yeah, we have to be careful. Even the specificity of our language indicates our understanding.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. If a person gets up from a lesson and they say, it feels great, that's a person who's disassociated from their experience.
No.
They've made their experience a third-person experience. If you ask them, what are you experiencing? And they finally go, I feel great. Now you've got them into an associated experience. Yeah. Now, if you ask them to disappear the I and just feel great, they don't even have the I there, but they're just completely associated. Their very nature is this nature of feeling great. And the happiness or the tranquility or the wholeness of that moment is intact in that moment. Now, in a training process, we don't make that shift. And the final shift, of course, if we want to go to the fifth dimension, is very simple. Disappear feeling great. And you find yourself in this vast void that you can sit in for a very long time if your mind doesn't become too active and you don't become worried about losing your identity. Now, these are the stages of the process. Now, when a person gets up from in a training and they're in a very open state internally, and they're connected and they're dimensionally clear inside themselves, and they're more connected to the space around themselves. Yeah. Mm-hmm. In the Feldenkrais world, people take that moment, which is incredibly important for your personal evolution, and they say, oh, I can tell my shoulders are so much better. I can turn my head so much more freely. Oh, look, I can walk so much more smoothly. I have such a sense of, in other words, we have reduced the work down to a physical quality rather than a way of being.
So this is what we were talking about just before you came on. Yeah.
So that's the real question is, I'm starting from listening to you, there's a craft of ATM and being clear and teaching an ATM in a craft way. And there's an art to teaching an ATM, to really connecting people to their wholeness and their whole being. And I guess we're hungry for that understanding of how we can engage someone in ATM to really get in touch with and leave an ATM, not in that groggy start and feeling a free shoulder, but really then be able to live their life with that free potency rather than just have an experience and have that separate from who they are.
Well, first of all, they have to have a value for it. They have to completely and profoundly value that's important to them.
Yeah.
Okay. Dennis Leary called it a moment of unadorned worldly engagement. That means they are not wearing their heritage. And in that moment, whatever has been their heritage is shed. And the moment itself of the now is simply here. Yeah. Now, of course, it doesn't take very long after a person has, if they've lived in the gravitational field of their own life for a very, very long time, and they're associated with that gravitational field, and they have this movement, and they have this moment, and then they transcend, like a rocket, they move out of that gravitational field, and they establish a new orbit for a few moments. The question is that orbit going to continue to go further and further? Do they have the means to continue to go further? Or is that orbit going to decay? And are they going to be pulled back by inertia and by gravity? And if they're pulled back, are they pulled back all the way to the place that they were before? Or are they pulled back a little bit less so that the next time they can leave, and the next time they can leave, and the next time they can leave, and they eventually come to the place where they are whole within themselves in a new orbit? And that can take years, let's be honest. That's not necessarily an overnight sensation, and it's not necessarily going to take place. I mean, it could take place obviously within a few weeks, or it could take place in the course of a training program, or it could take place you may wake up after a few years after a training program and go, oh shit, that's what that was about. Yeah, and have a complete realization of what that was for you. And it doesn't mean that we ever make it. The idea of enlightenment, which is a noun, it's a thing rather than a process. Mm-hmm. And to assume that our nervous system isn't a nervous system that doesn't want to continually evolve. And I consider what people consider to be mystical states, I consider them to be a stage of human evolution. I consider them to be an evolutionary state for human beings to develop to. Now, we can look very carefully within our own recorded recent history, and we can look at who could be considered the people that represent the highest quality of being. You could look at Ramana Maharshi. Yeah. And Carl Jung described Ramana Maharshi as, imagine a white sheet of paper against a white background. In other words, there was nothing obscuring him, nothing, it was just pure being. And he would be in his ashram in India, and he would sit out, they called him the mountain, and he would just sit out by the hour. And people would walk by just to be in his stillness, just to be touched by that stillness as a linchpin, it's a catalyst into the potential for themselves. And we have people that have high degrees of that kind of purity within themselves. I certainly don't. And I would never ever even, I don't want to be considered that way. I don't want to be a guy who sits, for myself, I'm not so interested in sitting in some kind of way that represents something that I'm not. I'm just vitally curious about how these people can become more comfortable in their lives and ask themselves, after you get up from a lesson, is this the quality of being that I want to be able to take forward in my life?
Yeah.
I don't give a whit about whether your ankle or your shoulder is better. Of course I care. That's part of the spectrum. Yeah. And people come for that spectrum. They come in order to have physical integrity after significant wounding and injury. But that's just a small part of the entire spectrum of what this work can offer.
Jeff, can I just say, I just want to repeat a phrase you just said. You just said, people can ask themselves, is this the quality of living or being or life that I want to take with me into the future? And I think I heard you say that in Awareness Through Movement lessons, and it's I think a reference to the kind of self-inquiry that we want to invite our Awareness Through Movement participants to engage in. And I'm wondering how we can extend that, how we can really invite that inquiry, invite people to inquire deeply into what this Awareness Through Movement experience is, and how can we deepen experience?
So I just want to say something about that, because I think it comes from us, from my being in this exploration myself, is where how I can transfer that or communicate that to the people that are in my classes. So for example, having been to, I'm going through all of your classes on Vimeo now as well. I'm doing one before I go to sleep. And my relationship with the ground is so phenomenal. Like, I'm now even, one of the first questions that I came to you with in the class was, I'm either sitting or I'm standing, or I'm lying or I'm standing, and there's nothing in between. So I'm now finding that I'm approaching the ground way more delicately, and as I walk, it's not just me and the earth, it's me and the earth. So
Yes.
I'm like seeking or knowing that there is an energy coming through the ground through me, and I am part of this world. And now I'm translating that into how going from standing to sitting. I'm not just plopping on my chair. I'm like, there's stuff in between here, so I can go down nice and gracefully, and I can rise gracefully, and that has me act differently. And I think the more I grasp that, or the more I be that, then the more I'll be able to communicate with the people in my ATMs. It's like wanting to share this experience. So I think that is part of the answer to this.
Well, so there's three little things I wanted to mention here at this point in time. First of all, the process, a great Feldenkrais teacher does not teach. They ask questions. And they know what questions they ask. They know how to create the environment, and they know how to ask questions. And the questions that they ask lead people into more and more specific details. In other words, it takes them further and further into the Weber-Fechner process, the sensorimotor process, which is what this work is. It's a concrete process to bring people to awareness. We're not listening to our breath. We're not counting numbers. We're not in a meditation process. We're actually attending to a concrete sensorimotor process. And the details, the more and more specific that we can become in the details, the more focused and laser sharp that our mind becomes, the more attentive we can become to these details. And then to be able to watch the micro aspect of the detail, then expand the detail out and further into ourselves, and go to the micro and into the expansion, and out into the micro and into the expansion, and then go from the inner experience into the outer experience, because awareness is always related to our experience in the environment. It's always related to our experience in the environment. If I ask you how many lights are in the room you're in, how many lights are in the room you're in?
That work.
Look around, find out how many lights are in the room. Yeah.
I got one. One that
Okay,
works,
great.
one that doesn't.
So when you're counting, what are you counting?
We're counting
It's
what we're
It's
seeing.
thought.
Yeah.
You're counting your own movements. Your relationship to the external world is your internal relationship to the external world. You're always related to your own experience of the world. And every movement that you make and every moment of attention that you're attending to is in relationship to the world, your internal world and the external world. And the question is of awareness is to very specifically be aware of that. So the first aspect of this question is how do I help people become more specific and so that they learn the process of specificity and asking questions.
Mm.
Yeah. So it's not the rhetorical scaffolding of the ATM lesson. Feldenkrais and Amherst says, if you never do these lessons again, it makes no difference. I'm teaching you how to organize the quality of your life. It's the process that you're teaching. It's the process that you're conveying to people. And the moment that it becomes outcome oriented, people seeking outcome, they end up in the same place that Suzuki Roshi in Zen Mind Beginner's Mind with his students. And he says, if for a moment you're meditating for an outcome, it's not meditation. And if you're doing an awareness through movement lesson for an outcome to improve yourself, it's not an awareness through movement lesson. It's not awareness through movement. It's not the process of attending. And as a result of that attention, the nervous system creates new variability. It creates a new resonant connections within the brain. The internal coherence in the system, the autonomic system, begins to come into a coherent state relative to the things that are happening in the environment. And the person has a different sense of wholeness. And I can't remember the other two things I was going to talk about. There were two more points, and I don't have the mind to remember the 3 points in a row. I'd have to write them down and then try to address them.
We liked your first point. It was brilliant.
Well, it is, I believe that it's pure Feldenkrais. I believe that was clearly his intention when he was teaching. And would he teach with he taught with a high measure of specificity at that time. Imagine him 35 or 40 years later, what would he be teaching?
Yeah.
Yes, what would he?
Yeah.
Well, with all the changes in the world of quantum physics and the understanding of life and life force and what is life, and he had such a clear understanding of life. Movement is life. Life without movement is unthinkable. It comes out of the which book is it? It's the Master Moves book. Yeah, it's a quote from the Master Moves book. And what does it mean? Everybody would think, yeah, movement is motility. No, that's not life. To live a life that's compulsive is not a life. Yeah. If you only have one way of doing, it's not a life. Now, to what degree of sensitivity can you become to life force, to connection, to being a part of? And how do you again pull back the veils, pull back whatever that obscures you from being connected with yourself, your own spontaneous, lovely genius, your own internal creative capacity, your own love for life, yeah? And what keeps us from finding that within ourselves? And of course, what keeps us from finding that within ourselves is our need to be safe. It's very difficult, very, very difficult to give up what has worked and has kept us safe this long. Yeah.
So as we're almost ready to graduate and become ATM teachers. So as we become ATM teachers, have you got some advice on being able to hold people safely as we, are teaching ATMs? What's that art of being able to ensure people can be safe?
Well, first of all, you have to hold them with love and care, and you have to care for them in a way that they don't know how to care for themselves. Feldenkrais, he came around to me, and he called me the stupid athlete.
Great care.
Yeah, he was brilliant, and always with a twinkle in his eye, and I have lots of stories. But he'd kick me in the toe and say, "Stupid athlete, it's not human movement." Because there was always an effort, there was always some element of pleasing, some element of and if you ever look at the Amherst material, you'll see that I have a lot of airtime in the Amherst material. Because I picked up a lot of things very, very quickly, and sometimes I would have this pre-knowing of where the lessons were going, and so I would arrive at the lessons, and of course I took great pride in that, which obviously kept me from really, really benefiting from the lessons. And so, but he would say to me, he'd say, I take better care of you than you can take care of yourself. And it took me 30 years to understand that.
Wow.
Yeah. So part of it, so that was part of what he did, was he cared for me. He cared for everybody in the class, and he cared for the quality of our lives. Yeah.
Because it's
So
in watching the trainings, that's not obvious. The way that he talks to people, the way he engages people, that's not obvious. But there must be something
let me give you a really, really good example.
Yeah.
Okay. Go to the very first lesson of the 5th week of the first year.
Okay.
And he's working with a woman who is clearly trying to please him. And she's in front of him, and she's a clumsy woman. And you watch the compassion he has for her and how he helps her recognize that it's out of anxiety and insecurity that she's trying to please him. And he's not even talking about this. But you can see this whole interaction, this transference, and this woman transferring onto Moshe and wanting to be recognized and wanting to be able to do it. And she's using effort to try to get to the process. Then the lesson is simple. It is simply sitting to rolling to lying. That's all it is sitting. It's sitting to rolling and coming back up. Yeah. And you watch the way that he cares for her, and you watch the result, and you watch the way that he amplifies the whole process and gives the entire class a discussion on the difference between exercise and learning. And you listen to that, and you'll find many, many examples. And he's having to break through really, really crustily obscured people who are bound and determined that he's not teaching them the Feldenkrais method. They want him to teach in an academic way. If a person has this difficulty, what do I do?
Yeah.
And you watch carefully. If you really go through the whole process, when in that class there was a consortium of people. In my class, I mean, I guess I have to say it that way. There was a consortium of people who developed a note-taking scheme. And 4 people every day would sit outside, and then they would verbatim write down every word he would say, and then they would get together and they would collaborate and they would collate the notes, and so that the whole class was going to have this set of notes, right? And Moshe had very clearly laid out the process by which they could learn without anxiety. And he said very clearly, the first thing that you do is don't take notes during the day. Then the first thing you do is you sit down and you write down what was emotionally important to you. What struck you the most during the day? Yeah. Then you sit and you remember what elements of the day you can fill in from the lessons. Then you find a group of people and have everybody else begin to pull together the lessons so that you're learning and reflecting with each other. And then if you really want to make your learning intact, have a conversation with someone from another culture and find out how they view the lessons differently. Yeah. And he said, if you do this, you're not going to be anxiety about getting these lessons. And there are probably 4 or 5, maybe 6 conversations where he becomes upset. He's ready to walk off the floor. He's going to have Yochanan teach. He's so upset. Yeah. He's doing his best to bring people to a place of maturation and security within themselves. And the class is resistant to that. They want to know they're safe. Why do they want to know they're safe? Because their limbic system, their whole paradigm means I have value if I can produce something that helps other people. My value is based on what I can produce in other people. That's where my value is. Moshe is saying, if you learn to care for yourself, you're not going to have to worry about having the information as to how to care for people. Yeah. Moshe is very clear. The class is confused. Yeah. But so you have to be really dedicated to what is it that you're teaching for. And that needs some requirement. Now, you're going to be new practitioners. part of the process is to just learn the chops. What's right, what's left, what's up, what's down, what's forward, what's backwards, and how will you help people coordinate these things? And out of that will become for you the language of how are you going to language that in a way that the people know that they are in the safest place possible for themselves, and that you're going to help, you're going to care for them in such a way that they're going to begin to learn what it is to care for themselves. Yeah.
So Jeff, then I'm really interested in your evolution. So what you're sharing now about the Amherst training, did that all come on reflection, or were there people at the time that could see or sense the compassion that was being delivered? Or is this all, like, did this come to you later? And what has been your evolution through being a practitioner?
Look, I was blessed in my life, and I have been blessed in many ways. So, and people that I know that are friends that are Jewish people just consider Moshe to be like a tough old Jewish grandfather. Yeah, they didn't take offense to the way Moshe was. Yeah, in this day and age, Moshe would be castrated by the populace for his political incorrectness, and he wouldn't give a shit. He really absolutely would not care, because part of the point of view is for people to see for themselves their own prejudice and their own protection, the way that they build for themselves a protective wall about themselves. Because someone who's, a white sheet against a white wall doesn't give a shit if there's someone who's politically correct or incorrect. It just doesn't land. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So let's be clear. Many of us have been so deeply injured and so deeply wounded, and we don't have the dignity and we don't have the ability to. We're seeing here in North America, we're seeing some of the most beautiful, I think some of the most beautiful things that are being said are coming from the Black population themselves. They recognize their humanity. Yeah. And they understand what they've been subjugated to for all these years. Now, we also have to have the sense of becoming that kind of sensitive, and we also have to know, we have to see it for what it is. I spent the time with Moshe, and because I had spent many years before I went into that playing basketball for various coaches, I had my butt chewed out more than a few times. I was late for practice a couple of times, and I paid dearly for being late. And I can tell you, I was never late again. I spent years studying Aikido. Before when I had gone to the training, I had been in dojos where the transference and the counter transference was huge. The students gave the teacher the power, but the teacher also had power. But at some point in time, you learn to see what it is that you're learning from the person, rather than give away to the person the power that you are giving them. Yeah. And so I was in that state with Moshe. I could just appreciate what I was learning. I wasn't in that particular place, and I enjoyed him immensely. But I have friends to this day who were in that training who are still consider themselves to be emotionally traumatized by the way that Moshe was. In other words, they haven't fully come to recognize the Feldenkrais method. Yeah. And they're the most avid, they're avid. They can't sit in the middle and see the progressive side and to see the conservative side, and see the two of them as the same thing as seeing our left side and seeing the right side and seeing the whole. Until you're not in a place of comfort with yourself personally, or become absolutely clear and aware, this is where I'm sitting and I'm choosing to sit in this side, and know it. Yeah. But if you can't listen to an argument on this side that makes sense and actually move yourself back and forth through positions, then what kind of freedom do you have? And Moshe, look at let's go back to Moshe and his early training. He was yeshiva trained. So in his training, he learned to debate. And what did he debate? He debated the Talmud. Yeah. And so he would, in 1 year, he would learn to debate one point of view. The next year, he would learn to debate against that point of view. The third year, he would learn to debate this point of view and that point of view. He was trained in the beginning. By the time he left Baranovich in what is now Russia, but at the time Poland, occupied Poland, by the time he left that, he already had this training of seeing that the whole was greater than the sum of the parts. That was already in his way of arguing. Yeah?
And that's really counter to our culture, really, that we take great pride in being associated with some part of an identity, a group, or a following, or a particular way of life. That it's something that I guess we really have to work at quite differently from. He did this at a young age.
Yeah, and he had to. I mean, again, you can look. I mean, there's a wonderful talk that he gives at the end of the first year, and you look at it. I think it's titled Feelings of Inferiority. It's right towards the end of the first year before he gives his talk on what is health. And his talk on what is health is absolutely important to listen to. You might want to put some different words in it, but the feelings of inferiority, and he talks about, imagine this, he's joined this youth movement, walking across Europe. He's left his home and on his own, and he's joined a movement, and they're walking across Europe. He's starving to death. He's in a Polish town where they're cooking pork in an alley. And he goes in and he eats pork. Now understand, here's a moment of his conditioning. As soon as he eats the pork, he pukes. He retches. He's been conditioned all of his life that pork is an unclean food. And it is completely identified with him in his orthodoxy and in his culture. Yeah? The Orthodox community has strictures or principles that says if you're starving, of course you can eat unclean food, yeah, to preserve your life. But Moshe is not that way. He says, he looks around and he goes, look, everyone else around me can assimilate pork and I can't. How can that be? I'm a human being and they're human beings. How come they can assimilate pork and I can't? What kind of 14-year-old kid at that point in time looks around himself and asks a question like that? And goes back and takes a homeopathic portion of pork and puts it in his mouth until he can assimilate it. So what has he done? He's with attention, listening to what his response is and inhibiting the cultured response, the conditioned response to the pork, until he can assimilate the pork. That's an act of genius. That's a complete act of genius. To not be bound by a person's conditioning and finding a way through, with attention to the smallest detail, the Weber-Fechner process, the smallest detail, the very beginning of how does this movement begin? How does my conditioned response begin? And do I have to have it? And can I inhibit it? Because otherwise he'd touched the pork to his mouth, the homeopathic portion, he would have thrown up again. But the portion was such that the stimulus was so small that he could sense within himself his response.
Yeah, I think there's a question in there for how we respond to the changes in our environment these days. Looking at Moshe's article on health and a healthy person being one who can live his unavowed dreams fully. But there's another little quote in here: the healthier the person, the more easily will he regain the conduct of his life after considerable sudden shocks by changes in all the necessities in life. And the changes that we're experiencing now in society, how do you see Feldenkrais as being able to add to people's experience these days? I think it's really going to be really important to bring to a lot of people.
I think this embodied contemplative process of the Feldenkrais method is probably one of the clearest, if not the clearest, pathways into helping people develop the resources. I would recreate the term that a healthy person has the resources to meet uncertainty in such a manner that they thrive.
That's nice.
That's what I would say a biologically fit person is capable of doing. They can meet the present moment. They have the resources to meet the moment, all of the uncertainty, and they have access to a quality within themselves. And as a result of that, they come out of the difficulty thriving. Right? So they're not just resilient. They're not just coming back to where they were before. If you listen to the last sentence you wrote, yes, that leaves people with the state of just resilience. And Moshe, he says it, in Amherst, you'll see that, and then he gives a talk. He says the first thing that a healthy person does is they recover from shock. That's what the second sentence you wrote about. They can recover from shock. But he says that a true health is the ability to reach your unavowed dreams. That means to have the resources within yourself to meet the world in such a way that you can thrive, that you can bring forward your unavowed dreams into the world. That means that you do not obscure yourself with your conditioning, with your habits, with your compulsions, with your neurosis, whatever terms you want to use, that you're alive, awake, clearly intent on being clear to the moment and bringing something essential into the moment. And that's the secret to teaching awareness through movement, is to teach from a place where you bring that clarity and that wholeness into the moment.
Yeah, that's very helpful. That is very helpful. Yes.
I've just given you the outline for my class the next 8 weeks.
Right.
Beautiful. Well, there's myself and Libby are participating in that, and Libby's going to come to my house to do it, and we're planning on including Heidi in the learning as well, so we can share and communicate our experience.
Heidi can't find a way to get off work so she can come too?
I'll find a way, Jeff. With my health and vitality, I'll find a way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll do this for you guys. Okay, this is a preview for you. Give me 1 second. I'm going to give you a preview of the curriculum for the next 8 weeks.
So for what we're talking about now is Jeff is offering an advanced training for ATM practitioners and students. It's online. It's really beautiful the way you've structured it too, in that people can go to, you've got 2 different time zones, so you really adapted into the Zoom world. It's awesome. And it'll be recorded so we can go through and catch up on the lessons as well. And yeah, so from Australia we can participate for 8 weeks and deepen our understanding of ATMs.
The Wednesday evening class is perfect for folks.
Yes.
In the sense that, it'll be probably what, 5 o'clock in the evening or something for you guys, or at noon for you guys.
It's 12 noon, yeah.
Take a lunch break, Heidi. Whoever started this meeting.
Oh, I think I've shut the share screen down.
Is there a share screen picture down in the very bottom of the?
No.
Can you make Jeff the host?
Yeah, I can do that.
It's while you're doing that, it's very relevant, Jeff, and looking forward to the training as a continuation of our investigation in we've just done a 5th segment
Great.
of our training. And
So who's your training with?
we've just trained with Zoran Kovic.
Yeah, I know Zoran, and he's lovely, and he's very much in line with these ways of thinking, I think, in some ways.
Yes.
So
Yes.
this is to include but not exclude, and this will be synergistic. But these are the at this point in time 14 points that I will be teaching from. I will not be, the ATM lessons will be there to amplify, as a sensorimotor experience, to amplify these points.
I'm imagining numbers 10's ATM with the ego dissolution. What we could possibly be doing for that one.
Any
I don't know yet.
ATM.
Yeah, any ATM
Yeah,
works,
any
actually.
ATM.
Yeah.
So that's going to be the point of the.
What's the Weber-Fechner?
What's that?
Weber-Fechner was down the bottom of that list. What's that?
Weber-Fechner?
Yeah.
That's the relationship between stimulus and response.
In the sense.
So say, for example, see, the whole point of the Feldenkrais method is to increase and enhance your sensitivity so that you can make discrimination, so that you can make choices. You can't observe a habit arising unless you can sense it arising. And we work in the concrete way in the physical world because it's a lot easier to sense a physical habit arising than it is to sense thoughts arising. So it's a good practice. So the Weber-Fechner formula is a formula that relates stimulus to response. And it works kind of like this. If I give you a weight of 20 kilos, and you're holding the weight of 20 kilos, how much weight do I have to add to the 20 kilos before you can sense a difference?
Mm.
So this is, yeah, the feather, adding a feather to a really lightweight.
Yeah, but if I have you hold a feather, how much weight do I have to add to the feather before you can sense a difference?
Mm-hmm.
If you're in a room that's filled with candles and you blow out one candle, then obviously you're not going to notice a difference. But if you're in a black room, a darkened room, and you light one candle, you'll see a hell of a difference. So it's a relationship between stimulus and response. And at what point in time, how many candles do you have to blow out before you can sense a difference? Yeah, if you have a room full of candles. Yeah. So we're always dealing in this realm with the Weber-Fechner process.
And I think then it's relevant that the Feldenkrais can be considered a practice. It's a practice as opposed to a lesson to be completed. It's
Or an answer. It's not an answer.
Yeah.
No, that you'll see when you listen to his talk on the first lesson of the 5th week of the first year of Amherst, and his talk on exercise and learning. You'll see that you've just given very much his answer. His answer moves away from that. If you take these lessons as an exercise, yes, you'll have a physical change, but that change will stay with you for 5 minutes. It'll be gone by the time you leave the building, because you've already adapted yourself back into the orbit has decayed, and you walk back into your own socialized way of being organized in the world. You put your own suit back on before you even know it, and you don't even know how quickly you put it back on. Yeah. Moshe used one of his favorite sayings is, "We return to our vomit like a dog."
It's so beautiful.
It actually is again a statement of his biblical knowledge. It's a proverb. It's a part of Proverbs. Yeah.
The richness was in his expression, and running right through his writings is really lovely to be interpreting and reading and having a go at, and you've given us a great insight, Jeff. Thank you.
He was clever. He was clever. He did not see reality in the way that a conditioned person sees it.
Yeah.
He was not bound by the normal rules of the normal conventions that most people live by in order to be social. He obviously knew that he wasn't going to go down the street and damage someone, but which he could have. He could be incredibly scary. There was a period of time when someone was arguing with him and he said, "You want to argue with me?" And he stood up and it was like he just made himself full. And I'll finish with one great story of Moshe. Yeah.
Great.
So he was presenting at a place near San Francisco called St. Mary's College, one of his first presentations. And he comes up on the stage and a woman in the back sees Moshe, and Moshe was rotund and his hair's all over the place and he's got these thick black glasses and he's having trouble with cataracts. And she stands up and says, "How can a fat man like you teach me anything about movement?" And people that were there that I know said Moshe walked forward on the stage, and with each step, he became immense. He literally filled the space. And he said, "Come up here, you skinny little thing, and I'll break you in half." And furthermore, there's a saying in Russia that when a skinny person like you is long since dead, a fat man like me is still alive.
Long live Moshe.
And you know, and I mean, it was very clear that this was not a person who was even, I mean, she was so set in her idea of what health and what vitality looks like, and she had no understanding of the immensity of this man and his background and his training and what he had gone through and what he was able to do. So you guys have to go. I hope this has been useful. I'm very sorry.
Oh, it's been fantastic. Thank you.
It's
really
wonderful.
looking forward to the training with you.
Yeah, we'll see how it comes together.
Be wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jeff.